In September 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte marched into Moscow expecting the war to end the way wars usually end. Russia had retreated for months, and now its greatest symbolic city was open. Moscow was taken. The Russian army was still alive. And the political finish line never arrived. So why did Tsar Alexander I allow Moscow to fall rather than force a decisive battle? Why did Russian command treat surrendering a national symbol as a weapon instead of a defeat? And why did Napoleon, master of fast, decisive campaigns, walk straight into a war with no ending built into it? Because this was not a retreat in panic. It was a controlled refusal. A strategy designed to make distance, time, and logistics do the killing. And once Moscow stopped being a prize, it became a trap. This episode is not about how Moscow fell. It is about why its fall did not matter in the way Napoleon expected. The strategic problem facing Russia in 1812 was brutally simple. Napoleon's army was tactically superior, operationally aggressive, and politically calibrated to force quick conclusions. If Russia fought the correct war, defending territory, protecting cities, seeking a decisive engagement, it would lose on Napoleon's terms. So Russian command faced a paradox. Defend what mattered most, and risk annihilation. Or abandon what mattered most, and gamble that the enemy would destroy himself trying to win. The strategy we are dissecting is not scorched earth as folklore describes it. It is not, winter saved Russia. It is a deliberate refusal to give the enemy what his system required, a victory that could be converted into political closure. This was a strategy built on denial. Denial of decisive battle. Denial of symbolic surrender. Denial of a timetable Napoleon could control. And it was terrifyingly fragile. Because if Napoleon recognized the trap early, if he redefined success, shortened his campaign, or disengaged, Russia would have sacrificed its heart for nothing. To understand why this gamble was even considered, we need to understand the strategic map that left Russia with almost no good options at all. This war did not begin as an existential gamble. It became one because of how uneven the strategic landscape was from the start. In 1812, Napoleon was not invading Russia blindly. He was executing a system he had refined across Europe: rapid concentration, aggressive maneuver, forced battle, political collapse. The Grande Army was not just large. It was designed to move fast, live off captured resources, and impose decisions before opponents could adapt. Russia, by contrast, faced constraints that were less visible but far more dangerous. Geography was its greatest asset, and its greatest liability. The empire was vast, but vastness only helps if time is on your side. Every kilometer ceded created political panic. Every retreat amplified the sense of weakness. Distance could grind an invader down, but only if the defender could survive long enough for distance to matter. Logistics cut both ways. Napoleon's army depended on forward momentum and local supply. Russia's economy, infrastructure, and population density were thin across the western territories. This made sustained defense difficult, but also meant there was little for an invader to consume once those areas were stripped. Politically, Russia could not afford to look weak. The court, the nobility, and the officer corps were divided. Some demanded battle to protect honor and legitimacy. Others understood that a correct battle against Napoleon might destroy the army outright. Tsar Alexander I ruled an empire that could endure hardship, but not open humiliation. Time was the most dangerous variable. Every week without a decisive engagement eroded Napoleon's logistical margin. Every week of retreat eroded Russian morale and political cohesion. And both sides knew this. Napoleon's objective was not Moscow itself. It was resolution. A treaty. A submission. A visible signal that the war was over and Europe's balance restored under French dominance. Moscow mattered because Napoleon believed Russia could not continue the war without it. It was the lever that had worked elsewhere. Russia's objective was simpler, but more brutal. Keep the army intact. Avoid annihilation. Force the war to extend beyond Napoleon's planning horizon. But that objective came with severe constraints. Russia could not trade space endlessly without consequences. Each retreat abandoned civilians, resources, and credibility. Each burned depot weakened Russia's own post-war recovery. Each delay risked internal revolt or elite defection. There was also the battlefield reality. Napoleon excelled at forcing engagement. If Russian forces were caught retreating improperly, without cohesion, without preparation, the entire strategy would collapse into a rout. This made retreat paradoxically risky. A single mistake could turn strategic patience into irreversible defeat. The Russian high command also faced a doctrinal trap. European military culture at the time prized decisive battle. An army that refused battle risked being labeled incompetent or cowardly. Commanders who retreated too long lost trust. This was not abstract theory. Russian generals were being criticized openly. Pressure mounted for confrontation. And yet confrontation was exactly what Napoleon wanted. The strategic map, then, was not about arrows and cities. It was about incompatible victory conditions. Napoleon needed a short war. Russia needed a long one. Napoleon needed a symbol to convert into peace. Russia needed to deny him that symbol, even if it meant destroying it. Napoleon needed momentum. Russia needed friction. But friction alone does not stop an army. It only slows it. For the Russian strategy to work, several assumptions had to hold simultaneously. First, the Russian army had to avoid decisive engagement without collapsing. Second, Napoleon had to continue advancing rather than recalibrating. Third, Russia's political system had to absorb humiliation without breaking. Fourth, time and logistics had to degrade the Grande Army faster than Russian morale degraded at home. None of these were guaranteed. And there was one more constraint that rarely gets discussed. Russia did not fully control the pace of its retreat. Each step backward was contested, by French maneuver, by public opinion, by internal power struggles. The strategy was evolving under pressure, not unfolding from a master blueprint. This is why Moscow matters. Not because it was militarily decisive, but because it was the last place where the war could still end conventionally. If Russia defended Moscow and lost, the army risked annihilation. If Russia defended Moscow and won, it would still face Napoleon's ability to regroup. If Russia abandoned Moscow, it would gamble everything on an unconventional logic that had no precedent at this scale. At that moment, the strategic map narrowed to a single question. Was it better to lose the war correctly, or to risk everything by fighting it incorrectly? And it was inside that impossible choice that a strategy no textbook would recommend began to take shape. Military doctrine in early 19th century Europe was not subtle about what Russia was supposed to do. A state facing invasion was expected to defend its territory forward. It was expected to protect major cities. And above all, it was expected to seek a decisive battle once contact was made. Napoleon's entire system was built on this expectation. He concentrated faster than his enemies. He maneuvered to force engagement. He destroyed the opposing army in a single climactic encounter. And then he converted that battlefield result into political submission. This was not recklessness. It was a proven model. From Italy to Austria to Prussia, wars ended because armies were broken and capitals fell. Doctrine, culture, and recent history all reinforce the same lesson: avoid battle too long, and you lose credibility, and you lose the war. From that perspective, Russia's behavior in 1812 looked irrational. Russian forces retreated again and again. They abandoned prepared positions. They yielded ground without trading it for decisive results. To Napoleon, this signaled weakness. To much of Europe, it looked like incompetence. And according to doctrine, it was. Because doctrine assumed three things that were true in most European wars, but false in Russia. First, doctrine assumed that territory and political legitimacy were tightly linked. Lose the capital, and the state collapses. This had worked repeatedly. Second, doctrine assumed that logistics favored the attacker early and the defender late. Napoleon's armies could live off the land long enough to force a decision. Third, doctrine assumed that commanders had strong incentives to end wars quickly. Extended campaigns were expensive, unstable, and politically dangerous. All three assumptions break down in 1812. Russia's political legitimacy did not hinge on Moscow alone. Its economy and governance were decentralized enough to survive the loss of a symbolic center. The Tsar did not rule by popularity in the modern sense, and could absorb pain that would have destroyed constitutional states. Russian logistics were not optimized for rapid counteroffensives, but neither were they dependent on fragile supply lines stretching across hostile territory. Time hurt Napoleon more than it hurt Russia. And most critically, Russian leadership did not share Napoleon's urgency. For Russia, a long war was not a failure of strategy. It was the strategy. This created a doctrinal mismatch. Napoleon was fighting a war designed to end decisively. Russia was fighting a war designed not to end. From a textbook perspective, Russia's refusal to stand and fight was unacceptable. From a systems perspective, it was the only option that did not lead to immediate defeat. But this is where the trap deepens. Because choosing to violate doctrine does not automatically create advantage. It creates exposure. By refusing decisive battle, Russia accepted several severe risks. 1. Morale erosion. Armies are not machines. Continuous retreat corrodes discipline, pride, and trust in leadership. At any moment, retreat could turn into rout. 2. Political fracture. Nobles, officers, and civilians demanded resistance. Each retreat strengthened the argument that leadership had lost control. 3. Operational capture. Napoleon specialized in turning movement into encirclement. If Russian forces miscalculated once, retreat would become annihilation. Doctrine existed for a reason. It reduced uncertainty. It provided rules that minimized catastrophic error. Russia chose to abandon those rules. Not because it had a better doctrine, but because the existing one guaranteed defeat. This is the key inversion. Russia did not believe retreat was superior to battle. It believed battle was worse than retreat. And that distinction matters. The decision was not driven by confidence. It was driven by constraint. Russian command understood something deeply uncomfortable. If they played Napoleon's game well, they would still lose. So they chose to play a different game, one with no clear victory condition, no clear timeline, and no historical reassurance that it would work. This is why the strategy felt wrong even to those implementing it. Commanders argued over how far to retreat, over when to turn, over whether Moscow was a red line or just another waypoint. There was no consensus doctrine to fall back on. And that absence created constant tension. Every decision was reversible until it wasn't. Every retreat raised the question, is this still strategy, or has it become paralysis? Doctrine teaches when to fight. It does not teach how to endure not fighting. Russia was improvising a form of warfare that most military cultures were psychologically unequipped to sustain. And Napoleon misread that improvisation. He interpreted retreat as delay before collapse. He assumed Moscow would force resolution because doctrine said it should. But doctrine only works when both sides accept its premises. By the time Moscow came into view, Russia had already exited the doctrinal framework Napoleon relied on. The city was not being defended as a fortress. It was being treated as expendable space. This was not an accident. It was the logical conclusion of a war fought outside the textbook. And yet, even here, the strategy was not complete. Because abandoning doctrine creates one final, terrifying question. If you refuse battle, if you refuse symbolic surrender, if you refuse to define victory conventionally, what exactly are you waiting for? The answer to that question would determine whether this strategy became a masterpiece or a national catastrophe. This strategy did not emerge as a clean, unified vision. It formed under pressure, through hesitation, conflict, and fear of making the wrong irreversible choice. Russian command did not sit down and decide to sacrifice Moscow as a grand design. What happened instead was more fragile and more revealing. The idea of retreat hardened gradually, as every correct option collapsed under scrutiny. At the center of this process was a leadership structure under strain. Political authority, military command, and public expectation were misaligned. The Tsar wanted survival without humiliation. Generals wanted clarity without annihilation. The nobility wanted honor without catastrophe. These demands could not all be satisfied at once. Early retreats were justified as temporary. Each withdrawal was framed as a maneuver, not a concession. But as distance increased, the language changed. Retreat stopped being explained as movement and began to be defended as necessity. This shift mattered, because it marked the point where leadership began quietly abandoning the idea of a decisive battle altogether. Inside the high command, disagreement was constant. Some officers argued that continued retreat would destroy morale faster than any French assault. Others warned that one major engagement could erase the army in a single day. There was no neutral option. Every path carried existential risk. The critical question was not whether Moscow should be defended. It was whether Moscow was worth the army. This is where the strategy crossed into unorthodox territory. Traditional military logic treats cities as anchors. Lose the anchor, and the structure collapses. Russian leadership inverted this logic. They began to treat the army as the anchor and territory as variable. This inversion was not obvious, and it was not universally accepted. It required redefining what loss and survival meant at a national level. Three core assumptions underpinned this decision. The first assumption was that Napoleon could not tolerate an open-ended war. His system depended on momentum, concentration, and political conversion of battlefield success. A campaign without resolution would drain resources, erode coalition stability, and undermine his aura of inevitability. Russian leadership believed that time itself was a weapon, as long as the army remained intact to enforce it. The second assumption was that Napoleon would continue advancing even when strategic logic began to turn against him. This was not guesswork. It was an assessment of his past behavior. Napoleon had always pushed forward to force closure. Russian command gambled that he would do so again, even when the cost-benefit balance shifted. The third assumption was the most dangerous. It assumed that Russia's political system could absorb humiliation without fracturing. Abandoning Moscow was not just a military act. It was a psychological shock. Leadership believed, without proof, that loyalty, fear, and inertia would hold the state together long enough for the strategy to work. None of these assumptions were guaranteed. Each one could fail independently. If Napoleon disengaged early, the sacrifice would be meaningless. If internal dissent escalated, the state could destabilize. If the army lost cohesion during retreat, there would be no second chance. This is why the decision was never announced as doctrine. It was executed quietly, incrementally, almost reluctantly. Moscow was not declared expendable. It was allowed to become indefensible. As the army pulled back, defensive preparations around Moscow were half-hearted by design. Enough resistance to signal seriousness. Not enough to force a climactic stand. This ambiguity was intentional. It preserved optionality. Until the final moment, leadership could still claim that battle was possible, while ensuring that it never truly occurred. What made this strategy unorthodox was not retreat alone. Armies have retreated before. What made it unorthodox was the refusal to define a recovery point. There was no declared line where retreat would stop. No promised counterstroke. No timetable for reversal. The strategy offered endurance instead of reassurance. This placed enormous psychological strain on commanders and troops. Soldiers are trained to fight toward objectives. Here, the objective was absence. The enemy was not to be defeated directly, but exhausted indirectly. This required discipline without reward, obedience without visible progress. At the political level, the decision demanded silence. Public justification would invite debate. Debate would expose uncertainty. Uncertainty would collapse confidence. So leadership allowed events to speak for themselves, even as those events appeared disastrous. Moscow fell not as a climax, but as an inflection point. The city's loss removed the last illusion that this war would end conventionally. From that moment on, both sides were locked into a campaign defined by endurance rather than action. For Napoleon, Moscow was supposed to end the war. When it did not, he faced a strategic vacuum. There was no enemy willing to negotiate, no decisive battle to justify withdrawal, and no political narrative to explain stasis. For Russia, the fall of Moscow was the point of no return. The gamble was fully committed. Retreat could no longer be reversed without invalidating the entire strategy. The army had to survive. Time had to work. And Napoleon had to remain trapped inside a campaign that no longer obeyed his rules. This was not confidence. It was constraint turned into calculation. The unorthodox decision was not to abandon Moscow. The unorthodox decision was to accept that victory might come without a visible act of winning. And that decision only mattered if the strategy could function in the real world, under pressure, scarcity, and constant risk of collapse. Because once theory gave way to execution, the margin for error disappeared entirely. On paper, the logic was clean. Avoid annihilation. Preserve the army. Stretch the campaign until Napoleon's system broke. But wars are not fought on paper. They are fought through mud, hunger, fatigue, fear, and small decisions made by exhausted men who do not see the whole design. This was the phase where the strategy was most likely to collapse, not because the logic was wrong, but because execution demanded near-perfect discipline under the worst possible conditions. The first operational reality was movement. Retreat had to be controlled, not reactive. Units needed to fall back in sequence, maintain cohesion, and deny Napoleon the opportunity to force encirclement. This was not a simple withdrawal. It was a moving front that had to look vulnerable without becoming weak. Too fast, and morale disintegrated. Too slow, and the French forced battle. Every road mattered. Every river crossing mattered. Every delay carried risk. Rear guards were not there to win engagements, but to shape tempo. Their job was to absorb pressure, create friction, and then disappear before pressure turned into decisive force. This demanded commanders who understood restraint and underrated skill in war. Logistics were the second reality, and they cut both ways. Russian forces were retreating across their own territory, but that territory was being systematically stripped. Supply depots were evacuated or destroyed. Food stores were removed. Infrastructure was denied. This was not random devastation. It was selective denial designed to break Napoleon's assumption that forward movement would solve logistical problems. But denial has a cost. Russian troops also needed food, shelter, and ammunition. They were not immune to hunger or cold. Retreat meant operating in increasingly barren zones, where the army had to rely on prepositioned resources and discipline to prevent foraging chaos. One failure in distribution could trigger desertion. One breakdown in command could unravel the entire formation. Weather amplified everything. Roads deteriorated. Wagons failed. Horses died. These were not dramatic battlefield moments. They were cumulative degradations. Every lost horse reduced mobility. Every broken wagon slowed the column. Napoleon's army had been optimized for speed and concentration. It was not optimized for slow attrition in hostile depth. The strategy depended on the enemy staying committed to forward motion. Napoleon did. He pushed deeper, believing that one more advance would force resolution. Each step forward lengthened his supply lines and increased dependency on a shrinking base. Russian command did not need to defeat him. They needed to keep him moving. This was where timing became critical. Retreat had to slow Napoleon without stopping him completely. If the French halted early and consolidated, the strategy failed. If they advanced too fast and forced battle, the strategy failed. The Russian response was calibrated harassment. Not enough to provoke decisive engagement. Enough to maintain pressure and illusion. There were moments when this balance almost broke. French cavalry probes threatened to cut off retreating units. Supply shortages triggered unrest among Russian troops. Local commanders faced impossible choices: abandon wounded, destroy villages, or risk exposure. Each decision carried moral and operational weight. This was not a clean strategy executed by abstraction. It was sustained by thousands of small acts of compliance with an invisible plan. One of the most dangerous phases came after Moscow was taken. At that point, the logic should have reversed. Russian forces could have attempted to counterattack. Political pressure intensified. The loss of the city created demands for action. Doing nothing now looked indistinguishable from failure. But acting too soon would have validated Napoleon's expectations. A counterstroke around Moscow would have given him the decisive engagement he had been chasing. Russian command resisted that impulse. They allowed Napoleon to sit in a hollow victory. This restraint was not passive. Russian forces repositioned deliberately. They threatened Napoleon's flanks and rear. They disrupted communications. They applied pressure without offering a target worth committing to. The goal was not to destroy the French army immediately, but to remove every comfortable option. Napoleon faced an operational paradox. Staying in Moscow achieved nothing. Leaving Moscow risked disaster. Advancing further was pointless. Retreating meant admitting failure without a victory to justify it. This paralysis was not accidental. It was engineered. But execution remained fragile. The longer the campaign dragged on, the more strain accumulated on both sides. Russian troops suffered exposure. Disease spread. Morale wavered. Commanders had to enforce discipline in a war that offered no visible progress. There were no captured flags, no triumphant announcements, no turning point battles to reassure the ranks. This is where the strategy nearly collapsed internally. If even one major Russian formation had disintegrated, Napoleon would have regained initiative. A rout would have allowed pursuit, forced battle, and possibly annihilation. The margin for error was minimal. Russian command could not afford symbolic victories. It could only afford survival. The true weapon of this strategy was not fire or steel. It was endurance under uncertainty. Napoleon's army, meanwhile, deteriorated in ways that were harder to reverse. Horses died faster than they could be replaced. Ammunition stocks became difficult to redistribute. Foraging turned violent and inefficient. Discipline eroded as survival instincts overrode command structure. These were not sudden failures. They were system failures. The longer Napoleon stayed, the worse his options became. Withdrawal grew more dangerous by the day. Routes that had been passable on the advance became lethal on the return. Russian forces did not need to block every road. They only needed to ensure that retreat happened under pressure. At this stage, the strategy reached its irreversible point. Russia could no longer reclaim what it had destroyed. Napoleon could no longer extract value from what he had captured. Both sides were trapped in the consequences of earlier decisions. What makes this phase critical is that nothing spectacular happens. No single event explains the outcome. There is no decisive battle to point to. Instead, the war turns on accumulation. Losses compound. Options narrow. The campaign becomes a problem of mathematics rather than tactics. And this is precisely why the strategy is so often misunderstood. Observers look for moments of genius or catastrophe. What they find instead is a system grinding another system down. The execution worked because it denied drama. It denied closure. It denied relief. But it could have failed at any moment. If Napoleon had disengaged earlier. If Russian discipline had cracked. If political pressure had forced premature action. If logistics had collapsed symmetrically. None of those things happened at the critical point. And that is why execution, not intention, decided the outcome. Because once the strategy began to function in reality, the final variable was no longer Russian control, but how the enemy would interpret what was happening to him. Napoleon did not fail to notice that something was wrong. He sensed it early. What he failed to do was reinterpret it in time. From the moment Russian forces refused decisive engagement, Napoleon understood that this campaign was deviating from pattern. But understanding deviation is not the same as abandoning a system built on decades of success. His responses were not irrational. They were consistent, with a framework that had never been truly challenged before. Napoleon read Russian retreat as delay before collapse. This was not arrogance alone. It was inference based on experience. Every major European opponent he had faced eventually broke once their capital or main army was threatened. Delay had always meant desperation. Resistance had always been finite. So when Moscow fell and no peace delegation arrived, Napoleon faced a contradiction his system was not designed to resolve. Victory had occurred without consequence. This created a strategic vacuum. In Napoleon's model of war, capture translated into leverage. Leverage translated into negotiation. Negotiation translated into closure. Moscow provided none of that. There was no Russian army begging for terms. No political fracture to exploit. No internal collapse to accelerate. Napoleon interpreted this not as intentional denial, but as irrational obstinacy. He assumed Russia would eventually behave normally. He waited. That waiting was the first critical error. By remaining in Moscow, Napoleon froze his own campaign. Movement had been his advantage. Now immobility became his liability. Supplies dwindled. Discipline eroded. The army existed without purpose. Each day in Moscow solved no problem and created several new ones. Why didn't he leave immediately? Because retreat without political justification was dangerous. Napoleon needed a narrative of success to stabilize his alliances and maintain legitimacy. Leaving Moscow without a treaty meant acknowledging that territorial capture had failed. That admission threatened his authority far beyond Russia. This was not a battlefield miscalculation. It was a political constraint. Napoleon was also constrained by information distortion. Reports from subordinates softened reality. Losses were normalized. Logistics were framed as temporary issues. No single data point screamed catastrophe. The system failed gradually, and gradual failure is easy to rationalize. There was also doctrinal blindness. Napoleon had built his career on forcing opponents to react. Here, he was reacting to absence. Russian forces did not present a clear target. They applied pressure without offering engagement. They attacked flanks, disrupted lines, then disappeared. This behavior did not fit Napoleon's decision-making templates. He interpreted harassment as weakness. He assumed that if he stayed long enough, the Russians would have to act. They did not. Another misreading was psychological. Napoleon believed Russia needed Moscow more than he did. He assumed symbolic loss would trigger negotiation out of necessity. What he failed to grasp was that Russia had already internalized that loss as part of the strategy. The emotional shock had already been absorbed. There was no escalation left for Moscow to provide. By the time Napoleon recognized that waiting was fatal, his options had narrowed. Advancing further was strategically meaningless. Staying promised slow destruction. Retreating meant exposure to the very depth and friction Russia had prepared. When withdrawal finally began, it was under the worst possible conditions. Russian forces did not need to defeat the French army in battle. They only needed to pressure it during movement. The retreat magnified every weakness accumulated during the advance. Napoleon still believed he could manage the situation. He had salvaged disasters before. But this time, the system he relied on, speed, concentration, decisive action, no longer applied. The campaign had become one of survival rather than control. The critical misinterpretation was this: Napoleon believed Russia was reacting to him. In reality, he was reacting to Russia's refusal to play. Once that asymmetry became clear, it was too late to reverse. This was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of adaptation. Napoleon did not lose because he underestimated Russian resilience. He lost because he overestimated the universality of his own model. The Russian strategy succeeded not by outthinking every move Napoleon made, but by forcing him to keep making moves inside a framework that no longer produced winning outcomes. And when he finally stepped outside that framework, by retreating, it was under conditions entirely defined by the enemy. At that point, the campaign no longer belonged to the attacker. It belonged to the consequences. The outcome of the campaign is often summarized in a single phrase: Napoleon retreated, and the Grande Army was destroyed. That summary is accurate, but strategically incomplete. What mattered was not that the French army suffered catastrophic losses. What mattered was how those losses were produced, and what Russia had to spend to make that outcome possible. From a narrow military perspective, the Russian objective was achieved. The invading force was no longer a coherent instrument of power. Its ability to project force eastward collapsed. Napoleon's aura of inevitability was broken, not by a decisive defeat on the battlefield, but by a campaign that refused to give him one. The war did not end with a treaty signed in Moscow. It ended with an army that could no longer impose terms anywhere. But this success came without a moment of triumph. There was no single battle that could be claimed as a victory of arms. There was only attrition, disintegration, and withdrawal under pressure. The Russian army survived, but it did not emerge unscathed. It emerged exhausted, strained, and carrying the burden of a strategy that had demanded restraint rather than heroism. The human cost was immense. Civilians paid first. The logic of denial required evacuation, destruction of food supplies, and abandonment of settlements. Entire regions were stripped of resources. Families lost homes and livelihoods long before French troops were defeated. This suffering was not collateral damage in the usual sense. It was integral to the strategy. The land had to be made inhospitable for the enemy, even if that meant making it unlivable for its own population. Russian soldiers paid a different price. Continuous retreat tested discipline and morale in ways that combat often does not. Soldiers are conditioned to accept risk in battle, not uncertainty without action. Months of withdrawal, deprivation, and ambiguous purpose eroded confidence. Many never saw a clear moment where their endurance translated into success. They endured because collapse was worse, not because victory was visible. The logistical cost was equally severe. Destroying depots and infrastructure denied resources to the French, but it also dismantled Russia's own economic base in the western regions. Recovery took years. Transportation networks, agricultural cycles, and local administration all suffered long-term damage. The strategy bought survival at the expense of prosperity. Politically, the outcome was double-edged. On one hand, the survival of the state and army strengthened the Tsar's position internationally. Russia emerged as the power that had absorbed and reversed Napoleon's greatest campaign. On the other hand, the decision to abandon Moscow left a deep scar. It demonstrated that the state was willing to sacrifice symbols and civilians to preserve strategic flexibility. That lesson would linger in Russian political culture, shaping expectations of endurance and acceptable loss. For the decision-makers, the psychological cost was harder to quantify but no less real. This was not a strategy that allowed for confidence or reassurance. It demanded sustained doubt. Leaders had to accept months of apparent failure while trusting assumptions that could not be tested until it was too late to reverse them. Every day the enemy advanced was a day that could be interpreted as proof that the strategy was wrong. That burden did not disappear with success. It merely became easier to justify after the fact. This is where historical interpretation often becomes distorted. Success invites retroactive coherence. Decisions that were contingent, contested, and uncertain are reassembled into a clean narrative of foresight. But at the time, the Russian strategy was never guaranteed to work. It depended on Napoleon continuing to behave as expected, on internal cohesion holding under strain, and on the absence of shocks that could force premature confrontation. Had Napoleon disengaged earlier, the campaign might have ended without decisive result, leaving Russia devastated and strategically exposed. Had internal pressure forced a major battle near Moscow, the army could have been destroyed. Had retreat fractured command discipline, the strategy would have collapsed into chaos. None of these outcomes were implausible. They were narrowly avoided. This raises the most uncomfortable question about the campaign. Was this strategy brilliant, or was it survivable only because the enemy made predictable mistakes? The answer matters, because it determines whether the strategy represents a model or a warning. If the outcome depended primarily on Napoleon's doctrinal rigidity and political constraints, then Russia's success was conditional. It worked against this opponent, in this context, under these assumptions. Transplant the logic elsewhere, and it might fail catastrophically. If, on the other hand, the outcome demonstrates a deeper principle, that denying an enemy closure can be more powerful than defeating him directly, then the strategy reveals something fundamental about asymmetric endurance at the level of states. The campaign also exposes a moral tension that cannot be resolved cleanly. The willingness to sacrifice territory and civilians to exhaust an invader challenges modern assumptions about the protection of populations. Yet it also reflects the brutal reality that states under existential threat often prioritize survival over welfare. This is not an ethical endorsement. It is a strategic observation. In the end, the campaign did not prove that retreat is superior to battle. It proved that battle is not the only way wars are decided. Victory emerged not from a single decision, but from the cumulative effect of refusing to give the enemy what he needed to turn success into conclusion. Russia won the war by making it unwinnable in the way Napoleon understood winning. But that raises a final problem. If this strategy worked by exploiting a specific opponent's assumptions, can it still function once those assumptions are recognized? Or does it become self-defeating the moment it is treated as a repeatable doctrine? To answer that, we need to strip this campaign down to its underlying strategic logic, and confront what it really teaches about power, endurance, and the limits of decisive war. This campaign is often remembered as a lesson about climate, geography, or national resilience. Those explanations are incomplete. What the Russian strategy of 1812 actually demonstrates is something more structural, and more unsettling. It shows how a state can win by refusing to participate in the kind of war its opponent is built to fight. At its core, This strategy was not about retreat. It was about denial. Denial of decisive battle. Denial of symbolic closure. Denial of a timetable the attacker could control. Napoleon's model of war required convergence. Forces converge. Battles converge. Political outcomes converge. Everything moves toward a moment where victory becomes legible and convertible. Russia broke that convergence. It allowed events to diverge instead, to stretch, to disperse, to lose clarity. This is the first principle the campaign exposes. Wars are not won only by destroying enemy capability. They are won by collapsing the enemy's ability to translate action into outcome. Napoleon could still maneuver. He could still fight. He could still occupy territory. What he could no longer do was turn those actions into a result that mattered. His system kept producing outputs that no longer resolved the problem. That mismatch, not winter, was fatal. The second principle is more uncomfortable. Strategic success does not require confidence. It requires tolerance for prolonged uncertainty. Russian leadership did not know this strategy would work. They accepted that all conventional alternatives were worse. This is a critical distinction. Unorthodox strategies often emerge not from insight, but from exhaustion of orthodox options. They are chosen not because they promise success, but because they postpone irreversible failure. That is why this strategy is so difficult to replicate. It demands a political system capable of absorbing humiliation without immediate collapse. It demands military leadership willing to endure criticism while appearing to fail. It demands a population that can be subjected to deprivation without triggering rebellion at the wrong moment. These are not tactical conditions. They are systemic ones. The third principle is about asymmetry, but not the kind usually discussed. Russia did not defeat Napoleon by being weaker. It defeated him by being differently vulnerable. Napoleon's empire was optimized for rapid campaigns and visible success. Russia's state structure was optimized, intentionally or not, for endurance, coercion, and delay. The Russian strategy worked because it exploited this asymmetry. It forced Napoleon to operate in a mode that magnified his weaknesses rather than his strengths. This is why the campaign should not be read as a universal lesson in strategic depth. Depth alone does nothing unless it interacts with an opponent's expectations. If Napoleon had been prepared to abandon symbolic victory early, the entire logic would have unraveled. Which leads to the fourth principle. Unorthodox strategies are not inherently superior. They are opponent-dependent. The Russian approach succeeded because Napoleon remained committed to a framework that required closure. The moment an enemy adapts, by disengaging early, redefining success, or accepting stalemate, the same strategy can become self-destructive. What looks like patience turns into paralysis. What looks like sacrifice turns into waste. This is why turning 1812 into doctrine is dangerous. The strategy was not robust. It was brittle. It worked because multiple assumptions aligned at the same time. Remove one, and the outcome changes radically. And yet, there is one lesson that does endure. Control over the meaning of success matters as much as control over territory. Russia did not win because it defeated Napoleon in the field. It won because it redefined what defeat would look like, and then refused to experience it. Moscow's fall did not end the war because Russia had already decided that losing Moscow would not constitute losing Russia. That decision preceded every other outcome. This is the real inversion. The war was decided not by what Russia defended, but by what it chose not to defend. It treated symbols as expendable and systems as sacred. It protected the army, the state's capacity to continue, and the enemy's dependence on resolution. In doing so, Russia transformed war from a contest of force into a contest of endurance. But endurance has a cost. It always does. The campaign normalized the idea that civilian suffering and territorial destruction could be instruments of strategy. It reinforced a political culture that valued survival over welfare. It embedded a precedent that the state may retreat, burn, and wait if that preserves its core. That precedent did not disappear in 1812. It echoes in later conflicts, in different forms, under different technologies. So the final question is not whether this strategy was brilliant. The final question is whether it was inevitable. When faced with an enemy whose strength lies in speed, decisiveness, and narrative closure, refusing to provide any of those may be the only remaining move. But it is a move that trades clarity for ambiguity, justice for survival, and victory for persistence. Russia did not defeat Napoleon by winning the war he came to fight. It defeated him by ensuring that the war he needed never existed. The Russian campaign of 1812 is often framed as a triumph of endurance over ambition. That framing is incomplete. What actually happened was more precise and more disturbing. A state confronted a superior system of war and chose not to oppose it directly. Instead, it withdrew from the rules that system depended on. This was not cleverness in the conventional sense. It was refusal elevated to strategy. Refusal to fight on schedule. Refusal to defend symbols on demand. Refusal to give meaning to an enemy's success. The result was not a dramatic victory, but a slow inversion. Napoleon advanced and gained nothing. Russia lost and survived. Over time, that imbalance became decisive. But survival came at a cost that cannot be romanticized. Civilians suffered. Territory was destroyed. The war asked ordinary people to pay for a strategic abstraction they did not choose. The state endured. Society absorbed the damage. This is why the campaign remains controversial. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded in a way that challenges comfortable ideas about strategy and morality. It suggests that under existential threat, states may choose to become unrecognizable in order to remain intact. The lesson of 1812 is not retreat works. It is that war is not only about defeating the enemy. It is about denying him the conditions he needs to turn action into outcome. And that lesson carries forward. Because whenever a power enters a conflict assuming that success will force resolution, there is always the possibility that the other side will simply refuse to resolve. Not by winning, but by enduring. That is not a reassuring lesson. It is a strategic warning.